So now we'll transition into a different topic, and that is multiple things can be true when evaluating Cincinnati and where they're at right now and Joe Burrow's injuries and the bad offensive line play. It can't just be one thing where we sit there and say, yep, it's the offensive line's fault, it's the personnel's fault, 100% their fault. Or it can't be a situation where you say, ownership, front office, it's 100% their fault they didn't surround Joe Burrow with competent pieces along the offensive line. It's 100% Zach Taylor's fault because he won't, change how he operates with spreading things out and constantly being in shotgun with Joe Burrow. No, you can't say that. It's not one person's fault. And also of note, when you're talking about these injuries for Joe Burrow, lots of them have happened on just basic football plays, right? The calf in training camp, basic football play. Right? I think it was like a play fake, and he's rolling out to his right, comes up gimpy with the calf. He's just playing football, right? The sack this past week with the toe injury. Yeah, it's not good that his pocket continually collapses on seemingly every other play. That's a problem. But, from a sack perspective, it wasn't that bad, right? It's a sack in the NFL, right? It's not like his head came off or it's not like they were diving at his knees or anything. It's just a basic sack, and he got hurt on it. The wrist thing, right? He fell on his wrist earlier in the game, and then he tried to throw it to the end zone, which he didn't try. He succeeded in throwing it to the end zone. It was a touchdown, but then, he tore the ligament in his wrist. Just basic football plays. The only one that wasn't was the knee, his rookie year, when his knee just got completely ruined in that game against Washington. That's really the only time where you can sit there and say, offensive line's fault for how that transpired. Now, all the other times that he gets blown up, I understand, right? Because he's been hit more than anybody in the NFL. I totally get that. But as it relates to specifically those injuries, for the most part, they've been just basic football plays. And that certainly is something that, especially if you're Joe Burrow and a Cincinnati Bengals fan, that's got to be tough to digest, right? Because it's not like they've been these crazy plays for the most part, just basic football stuff. It's a contact sport, and he's found himself suffering serious injuries on some of those. Another thing that's true is the Bengals have never put a great offensive line in front of Joe Burrow, despite continually trying to, right? They've drafted guys. We talked about this yesterday on the show. They drafted Dylan Fairchild. They drafted Amarius Mims, right? They drafted Cordell Volson, right? All guys that they drafted. And they also made allocations in free agency, bringing in guys. Orlando Brown Jr., we talked about that. That was one of the splashiest moves in free agency a couple of years ago, and honestly, it was a shocking move that Cincinnati went out there and made that type of move. Has that worked out? He's been solid, right? But he hasn't been that guy that just doesn't get beat and is that left tackle that is just unbelievable, and you don't even have to worry about pressure coming from that side. No, he hasn't been that good, but he's been solid for you, right? Ted Karras, Alex Kappa in free agency. Ted Karras is a guy that you've extended twice. Clearly, you like Ted Karras as a leader and as a center of your football team. He's done a nice job. Kappa, when he first got here, he was okay. Mind you, he was on that line in Tampa Bay that won a Super Bowl with Tom Brady. So bringing him in, that seemed at the time like a pretty good move. Obviously, hindsight will tell you that, it didn't end up translating here in Cincinnati as he was one of the worst guards against pass rush in the National Football League. That was an issue. Also, the organization opted to pay T. Higgins $30 million per year, and I think a large reason why they did that is because Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and to some extent Zach Taylor were pushing for it. If they don't pay T. Higgins, can they go get a big-time offensive lineman and pay him a bunch of money? Yeah, they can. But all of us, maybe not all of us, but I certainly was, saying that they needed to bring T. Higgins back. Going into last year, in 2024, I was kind of like, all right, this is going to be T's last year here with the Bengals, and we'll see how it goes. And then as the season progressed, and he wasn't out there with the hamstring early, and then he was out there, it became pretty obvious that, this Bengals offense without T. Higgins is not the same. Yeah, there's a lot of upside with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, but they need T. Higgins. And then, you have Joe Burrow after the Monday night game in Dallas coming out saying, yeah, T. Higgins is a need. And it's like, Joe Burrow, is the face of the franchise, the face of the organization. He's going out there saying, yeah, we need T. Higgins. That's certainly very, very noteworthy when you're talking about the Cincinnati Bengals, right? And then he goes out there against Denver late in the year and basically wins that game with Joe Burrow. And then it was like, okay, yeah, we do need T. Higgins. And then the organization, a lot of people in the fan base, lots of people on the football team saying, we need T. Higgins. What did the Bengals do? They went out there and they got it done. I still think it was the right move, even after this injury. All right, I think paying T. Higgins was the right move. But now you're sitting there with no Joe Burrow, and you could have allocated some resources there towards your offensive line. Instead, you opted to pay Joe Burrow. Another thing that is true is that they still, despite paying those two wide receivers, probably could have done a better job addressing that position earlier on in free agency. Right? Lucas Patrick was the guy you got at the end of free agency, and he was a guy that was a journeyman. He bounced around the National Football League and was never looked at as that guy, that bona fide starter for any team in the National Football League. And ultimately, Cincinnati kind of, as they addressed the media in the offseason, what have you, they were trying to spin it like, oh, yeah, we feel pretty good about Lucas Patrick being a starter for us. And the rest of us were sitting there scratching our heads saying, well, he hasn't really been a starter for large chunks of his career. He's been more of a career backup that has bounced across numerous different teams, and they were looking at him to be their starter, and obviously he was going into that Cleveland game. And then Dalton Risner, right, who has had some success in the NFL with Minnesota over the past couple of years, right? And at the end of the day, there's a reason why he was available a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, he had interest from some other teams, but if this was a guy that was, a great offensive lineman, he would have been long gone by the time Cincinnati had the opportunity to potentially sign him. And then next thing you know, he's out there for this Bengals team after one singular padded practice. Pretty crazy that he's out there protecting Joe Burrow at the time after one padded practice with the Cincinnati Bengals. So even if you're sitting there saying, yeah, we'll pay Jamar Chase, we'll pay T. Higgins, you were in a spot where you probably should have addressed the offensive line a little bit more there as well. As I mentioned, 3 of the 4 big Burrow injuries have been just normal football stuff, right? It hasn't been a situation where there are these crazy plays and he just gets, blasted and then he's, mangled on the ground. We've seen those plays happen, but he's been able to pop up and be just fine. The ones where he's getting hurt, for the most part, besides the knee, of course, are just regular football plays. And also, I know some people push back on like, oh, how could you, say it's the way he plays. Like, come on, that's just ridiculous. Nah, there's some truth to that. The way Joe Burrow plays is different than the way most every other quarterback plays in the National Football League, and that is why, in large part, he is so great because of the things he can do at extending plays and whatever the case may be. And the style of play that Cincinnati operates with, and Zach Taylor really defended, as we played earlier in the on off the bench, really defended his play style of all the shotgun stuff with Burrow. Right, he doesn't like being under center. He doesn't like turning his back on the defense. What they want him to do is use his elite processing skills, because nobody probably processes at the rate that Joe Burrow does in the National Football League. That is his superpower. They don't want him turning his back to the defense. They want to keep everything in front of him and let him process and let him operate and let him cut it loose. And that makes it hard to play offensive line, right? When you don't necessarily have that under center threat, where you don't necessarily have a ton of let's line up, let's run some play action, especially if you're not running the football well. It's a lot easier for a defense, regardless of the score in the game, to really pin their ears back and get after the quarterback when you're in a spot where you're constantly in the gun with lots of wide receivers lined up in obvious situations where it's like, okay, they're obviously going to throw the football here. It's tough for an offensive line, and obviously his playing style makes it a bit more difficult too, as far as holding on to the football and extending plays. And Joe Burrow gets rid of the ball quickly when he's just reading and going, but it's when things break down and he tries to extend. When the play works and one of his first couple of reads is there, he's catching it and he's cutting it loose, right? The stats will tell you that. But when things break down, he likes to hold on to the ball. He likes to jump around the pocket, and that can make some things very difficult for Cincinnati. So the bottom of the line is this. Lots of things can be true. There is not a single reason why, this injury happened, right? And again, the last thing is that, he's injury prone. We talked about it yesterday. It sucks, but it's just the reality of the situation. It is what it is. It sucks for Joe. You're sick for him. You're sick for yourself as a fan. But that's just the reality of where things are at with the Cincinnati Bengals right now. So multiple things can be true as it relates to the Bengals' ineptitude to keep Joe Burrow healthy. Some of it is them as an organization. Some of it is offensive line. Some of it is coaching. Some of it is bad luck. Some of it is him being injury prone. Some of it is him and the way that he plays quarterback. All these things happen. And unfortunately, this is going to be something that follows Joe Burrow for the rest of his career. Even if he's healthy for the next 5 years, it's like, well, he could get hurt at any point, and he's had, 3 basically season-ending injuries, as it relates to being a starting quarterback in the National Football League. And that's just something that is going to continue to follow him around. And one last thing I'll say before we kind of transition a little bit to other topics here on today's show is that I'm starting to worry a little bit about up here from Joe Burrow, the mental. Because these injuries, man, look, I was a high school athlete, right? I wasn't a college athlete, certainly not a professional athlete either. But, when you continually get hurt and you have to rehab and it's a different injury and it's a different body part, I mean, rehab, man, it's a lonely place, right? Because, you might be showing up to the facility or whatever, but it's early mornings and late nights when you are rehabbing, trying to get back to where you were. And that's the thing. He's just trying to get back to where he was, right? Or even close to where he was. It's not like he can rehab to get better. No, he's going the other direction, right? Because he's hurt. That's just the nature of rehabbing an injury. And, Joe Burrow, he's got, from what we can tell on the outside, seems like he's got, a very stable family as far as his parents go, and they're going to help him out. But, it's not like he's got some big family or, a wife to lean on or whatever. It's just him. And he's had to go through all these injuries himself. And you start to worry a little bit because Joe Burrow has been this, Superman, Iron Man type of guy with incredible focus and incredible resilience and incredible toughness. But at some point, you got to wonder if that snaps at all. Hopefully it doesn't, right? For Joe's sake and certainly for, Bengals fans, for our sake as well. Because with Andrew Luck, it snapped, right? And, the comparisons there, when you take a look at the stats of, how much they're getting hit. Luck played 6 years. This is year 6 for Burrow, and some of the stuff is eerily similar. Maybe we'll break down the exact numbers on a later show, but you just got to wonder, and especially with Luck, because he, in the same way, he was so tough, right? He took the punishment, he got up, he got hurt, he rehabbed it, said all the right things, was locked in, was, that ultra aggressive, tough alpha guy, and then he just kind of, out of nowhere, he's done. I'm not suggesting Joe Burrow is going to retire. I'm not saying that at all, but you have to worry a little bit about the mental of Joe Burrow. This guy's won the comeback player of the year twice. Now, he did say, hopefully he's never up for it again, but he said if he's up for it again, he's going to win it again. So, we'll see. I don't know how that exactly works, if he plays the end of this year, if he could still be the comeback player of the year in 2026. I don't know. But bottom line, he's going to miss a lot of time this year with the toe injury, and we'll see. And I'm worried about, how he's going to come back and handle this, right? Especially when everything had kind of gone right leading up to this point, right? You win your first game. You don't have people, you didn't play well offensively, but you didn't have people say, you're 0-1 again. You win your first game. You had a great training camp. You played in the preseason. You worked some kinks out in the preseason. You paid Jamar. You paid T. Everything was lined up for you to have an incredible year once again. And then, unfortunately, you had the injuries. So, I don't know the next time that we're going to hear from Joe Burrow, the next time he's going to address the media or what have you. But, I think we're all a little bit anxious to see what his kind of mindset is like. Because obviously it's incredibly frustrating for him. But, is this something where he's going to continue to be able to fight through and continue to battle through? I'd certainly hope so. Because the last thing you want to have to deal with is thinking about life without Joe Burrow here in Cincinnati. We're kind of working a little bit ahead here on today's show, but I do want to bring up a couple of points. At some point, should the Bengals draft a quarterback? Yeah. Not in the first round, not in the second round, but maybe like a third or fourth round guy. Maybe you're at the point where you need to do that, especially if you lose Jake Browning at some point. Now, maybe you keep Jake Browning, and he's fine being the backup here, whatever, and then you're just fine. But maybe you need to allocate a mid-round draft pick to another quarterback. But the suggestion that you could perhaps think about moving away from Joe Burrow is just completely ridiculous, right? I don't care if this happens 3 more times to him, right? As long as when he's out there, he shows you that he is still an elite quarterback, you just got to keep riding with him, right? And, something that I have said, if the Cincinnati Bengals can't win a world championship with Joe Burrow, they will never win a world championship. I believe that. And obviously there's no way to really measure that, right? But that's, at the end of the day, that is what I believe. If you can't do it with Joe Burrow, you will never be able to do it. I don't care who the coach is. I don't care what ownership looks like. I don't care what your draft picks are or the guys that are on your team or who the quarterback is. You're not going to be able to do it if you can't do it with Joe Burrow. So, I just really hope everybody certainly stays patient and that Joe is able to battle through this mentally, rehab it, and be back to a situation where he can, play winning football for this team, whether it's the end of this year or if it's not until 2026. But certainly the mental of Joe Burrow is something that I think isn't really getting talked about a lot. That probably should be a little bit.